our session right now, and so Zoom has been putting a kind of a warning that you have to click. I don't know if that's going to be true today, but just acknowledging that yes, you're being recorded and you're okay with that. So welcome to today's virtual journey. I am Betsy Moe, mission co-worker in the PCUSA and Intercultural Encounters Facilitator for CEDEPCA. Today we recognize that all human beings, from birth to death, are in motion, constantly being called by the Spirit of God to live and to love more faithfully. We all long to move from who and where we are to who and where God wants us to be. A song is going to open today's topic. And before I introduce this song, I would encourage you all to turn off your microphones, and to optimize video today, you might want to turn off your video as well while we play videos. That tends to help things. So this song is written and performed by Naik Madera, an all-women's music group from Guatemala. Haiti Gressy of Naik Madera is with us today. Haiti, will you please wave and say hola to everyone so we can see you?
Hola a todo el mundo, mucho gusto. Nice to meet you.
We're so glad you're here.
Hi. Hola.
We are excited to be able to begin our journey today learning from the heart, which music allows us to do. So sit back, relax, and listen to some music to open our time together.
Cruzar las fronteras para no vivir con tantos problemas. Los caminos que dejaste hoy son recuerdos que llevaste. A veces es necesario cruzar las fronteras para no vivir con tantos problemas. Los caminos hoy son recuerdos que llevaste. Oh, 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 a veces esperas de todo escapar para no afrontar lo que debes, aún así recuerda que por muy lejos que estés, no olvidar quién eres. A veces esperas de todo escapar para no afrontar lo que debes, aún así recuerda que por muy lejos que estés, no olvidar quién eres. Eres el que lucha, el que va tras sus sueños. Las condiciones te hicieron migrar, pero no cambiar tu identidad. Oh, tú eres la valiente, tú eres la que lucha, la que va tras sus sueños. Las condiciones te hicieron migrar, pero no cambiar tu identidad. Tú eres la valiente, tú eres la que lucha, la que va mal, para no vivir sufriendo, para no vivir aguantando, para no vivir muriendo, migrar, para no vivir mal, para no vivir sufriendo, para no vivir aguantando, para no vivir muriendo, porque migrar no es un delito.
Thank you, Mike Madera. That was wonderful. On behalf of the entire CEDEPCA staff, welcome to today's virtual journey in which we will be talking about migration and deportation in the face of COVID-19. My name is Judith Castañeda, and I'm the General Coordinator of CEDEPCA, the Protestant Center for Pastoral Studies in Central America. On today's journey, we will be traveling from Guatemala to San Francisco and back to learn more about what's going on with immigration. Some of you already know a lot about this topic. Others are just learning about the situation. We welcome all of you. We're happy that you are here with us. And we do hope that by the end of the day, when we return home, we all will have fresh perspectives and ideas to be a voice for the voiceless wherever we live. We will start our journey today at the CEDEPCA Center here in Guatemala City, where Esvin Sirin will lead us in a reflection about immigration from a personal and biblical perspective.
Hello, my name is Esvin Sirin. I am in charge of the logistic and I am a facilitator for the Intercultural Encounters program. I would like to share my testimony as a migrant and deported person from the US. In 2002, my mother, after several attempts of applying for her visa and being rejected, decided to make the trip to the US. I have a brother that has been living there since 1990s, and she wanted to see him, her grandchildren, and spend some time with them. So we migrated together. I was 15 years old. I attended to high school for 3 years and graduated in 2005. After working in a car wash and gardening and not making much money, I was encouraged to go to a vocational school to become a certified nursing assistant to make more money. That was a gratifying job. I met a friend who also worked at the same facility, but there was jealousy from his side, and he turned me into the California Health Department. As a result of that, I spent 3 weeks in the Riverside County Jail. After that, I was turned in to the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. ICE flew me in to Louisiana. It was my first time getting on an airplane. I spent a month in Louisiana before getting deported in August the 10th, 2009. I arrived at the Guatemalan Air Force wearing the uniform and the sandals from the detention center. I felt a criminal. I felt I was a bad person by the way I was treated, and also by the way I was kicked out of the US. I arrived in my own country. At that point, I felt I had lost my identity. I thought I had belonged to the US society, but that was not the case. I felt a stranger in my own country. That reminded me of the passage of Matthew 25:35. I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. The word stranger resonated in my mind and heart. But in Guatemala, I learned and experienced that God is a God of strangers. There was a point in the process of understanding why I was deported that I thought God only listens to the prayers in English, because when I was in the States, I had everything that I needed. Now it seemed that my prayers were not reaching God. How wrong I was. It was here in my community of faith in CEDEPCA that I learned the preferential love that Jesus has for the strangers. When I had no place to go, my community provided me shelter and company. CEDEPCA provided me education that transformed me and walked with me to rediscover my identity. It was in the church that I served that I felt accepted, supported, loved. They saw abilities that I did not even know I was blessed with. Truly, I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, you did it to me. I believe it's in another one walking towards me that can move me and remind me about Matthew 25. And through that, we can change the way we approach and welcome our neighbor. It is the stranger who we need to encounter, because according to the Gospel of Matthew, it is one way to encounter or help Jesus himself. We need to be reminded that since we migrated, we need to be reminded that since we left our mother's womb, we migrated into this world. That means we all have migrated in our lives. How are we received when born? How are we treated and cared for? We do not remember, but we do know how we treated our little ones. How we would like to be welcomed by Jesus. How do we see people that look different from us? Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, you did it to me. I hope we can see all people as human beings, as gifted, as contributing in our communities. The kingdom of God will be present here and now when we recover the power of welcome in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Esmond. We are going to go into breakout rooms for 7 minutes so that you can meet and share with a few of your travel companions today about this topic. Each person will have a little over 1 minute to share. So please share your name and where you're from, and then about a time that you have been welcomed by or when you have welcomed a stranger, or when you have been welcomed by someone else. The question will be in the chat box, and there should be someone to start the conversation in every breakout room. We're trying something new today, so hopefully it works. If you don't have someone in your breakout room that seems to know what they're doing, just somebody step up and you can start the conversation. When have you been welcomed, or when have you offered welcome? See you soon.
Hi, Gene. This is Eric Moe. So right now people are going into breakout rooms. Do you see a button to click to go into the breakout room? There should have been something that came up that said that tried to put you in a room. You're muted. I can't hear you.
I was muted.
Oh.
I'm trying to stay out of this because I've never done it before. I don't know what to do next, and I'm feeling kind of lost.
Well, it'll just walk you through it. You can't really get lost. But right now we're in some small group discussion things.
Right.
So did you see a thing that popped up and said to go to the breakout room?
Well, before this, yes, and it said breakout room 2, and then it said sign in, and then it said later, and I said later.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, you needed to just click OK or just go to the breakout room. I don't know if I can.
How do I do that now?
Well, let's see. I might be able to get you there here.
Oh, he's trying to get me back to a breakout room.
Sorry, I should have been down here.
Oh, that's okay. Well, I don't see how to move you. Just we can just see. I guess there's a chat question. You're supposed to just share your name, where you're from, and a time that you've either welcomed a stranger or been welcomed by someone.
Oh, word.
Well, my name is Eric Moe, and I'm actually in Spokane, Washington right now.
Okay, I've got something. I just clicked on more. It says join breakout room. So
Okay, yeah, you could go ahead and do that if you want.
okay,
If it
she's
works.
assigned to breakout room 2, so we're gonna go there.
Okay, I'll see you later.
What are you doing? Are you muting me? No, somebody else muted me.
Estuvo emocionante.
Welcome back from the breakout rooms.
Sorry, Epstein, we didn't talk fast enough.
No, sorry, it's all right. Okay, welcome back from the breakout rooms. I hope you have been able to meet someone or to see someone that you already knew. I pray that the hospitality in the world will be extended to everyone, but especially to the least each day. To quote the Migrant's House here in Guatemala, we cannot get to God unless our hands and feet get dirty.
Thank you, Esvin, and thank you, everyone. My name is Nancy Carrera. I am the Program Coordinator for Intercultural Encounters. Now, we will get on the bus and take a short ride to the University Rafael Andívar, where we will listen to our professor, Lisbeth Gramajo. I am happy to welcome our main speaker for today, Lisbeth Gramajo Bauer. Lisbeth, will you please wave and say hello?
Hello, good morning.
In a moment, we will play a video where Lisbeth shares about today's topic, and later we'll have an interaction time with her for questions and answers. At the beginning of the video, you will be listening to Lisbeth, and when the presentation starts, you will hear the voice of Leslie Vogel, who recorded her interpretation. Remember to use the chat box to write questions for Lisbeth as you think of them.
Buenos días. Mi nombre es Lisbeth Gramajo. Soy politóloga y antropóloga guatemalteca y actualmente trabajo como investigadora en la Universidad Rafael Andívar en la ciudad de Guatemala. En la universidad trabajo como investigadora en un instituto donde uno de los temas es el tema migratorio. Es por ello que esta mañana voy a compartir con ustedes una presentación en la cual abordo el tema migratorio en Guatemala, específicamente el contexto actual que estamos viviendo con el contexto migratorio a partir de la pandemia por coronavirus.
So I'm going to share this presentation, which I have entitled Migration, Deportations, and COVID-19. First, we need to begin by saying that Guatemala has a long history of migrations. Migration in Guatemala has been a survival strategy for Guatemalan families, for the Guatemalan population, especially for increasing family incomes for Guatemalans. So there are two modalities of migration which have existed in Guatemala for many years. On the one hand, internal migration, primarily among the indigenous population of Mayan origin, have opted to migrate from their indigenous communities towards the southern coast of Guatemala. In the southern coast of Guatemala is where the agricultural plantations exist for export crops, but also there's a lot of migration towards the city of Guatemala, where a lot of the services and industries are concentrated. So we see internal migration has existed for many years as a survival strategy for the families, especially the indigenous families. Also, another modality of migration which has existed for many years is trans-border migration, especially towards Mexico, since Guatemala shares a border with Mexico. So many Guatemalans migrate in a temporary manner to find temporary work in agriculture or in various services like hotels, restaurants, etc. in Mexican territory. Nevertheless, when we talk about international migration, we're talking about a more recent migration. We're talking about more or less the decade of the 70s, when international migration began, crossing Guatemalan borders and going further north. The primary destinations for this migration have been Mexico, the United States, and Canada. Among the causes that motivated this migration in the 1970s, we found on the one hand, the internal armed conflict that we know in Guatemala. There was a war of 36 years, which created a lot of political instability, as in addition to many deaths and displaced people, which caused many people to opt for migration towards the north as a survival strategy. Another of the causes have been the earthquakes and natural disasters. For example, in Guatemala in 1976, there was an earthquake that caused terrible destruction throughout the region, especially in the highlands, the western highlands of the country, a primarily indigenous region in which so much damage was caused by the earthquake that many people decided to leave the country. We also see that not only the war, but also the natural disasters provoked in that moment high levels of poverty and unemployment. So we could all say that these three factors began to unleash a migration towards the north during the decade of the 1970s. So for this reason, when we speak of international migration, we say that there have been approximately 5 decades of international migration towards the United States, for example. We began in 1970 to 1980, where the causes that I mentioned before were the internal war, the earthquake, and the economic situation, which caused people, the first migrants, to leave towards the United States. We have called these migrants pioneers. Why? Because they are those migrants who arrive in the United States and begin to open the pathway, begin to find places to live, places to work, and they open the way for others to begin to arrive, and that's what happens in the decade of the 90s. In the 90s, we see that migration intensifies towards the United States, primarily men, heads of family, those who begin to migrate, but we also see that they create migration networks. These migration networks are those persons both in the destination place as well as the place of origin who allow the arrival of new people. Why? Because maybe there are brothers, parents, friends, neighbors who help new migrants to incorporate themselves in the United States. During the decade of the 2000s, we see that migration diversifies. Now we see in this decade that women begin to migrate and the migrant networks begin to consolidate. We see that after so many decades, the networks become consolidated and allow now the women to begin arriving. During this decade, we talk about the feminization of the migrations. Why? Because now we begin seeing more and more women in the migration route. Finally, we arrive at the decade of the 2010 to 2020, which is the moment that we're in right now. And that's where we say that we're in an advanced stage of Guatemalan migration. Again, why? Because now it is not just men and women who are migrating, but also we see that they are traveling in the company of their children, or we also may see migration of unaccompanied minors. Many of these minors are migrating because what they're seeking is to reunite with their families. because many of the family members are already in the United States. Sometimes the father or the mother already migrated previously to the United States, and now it is the children who are seeking reunification with them. It's in this decade when we hear the whole issue about migrant children and adolescents. So what we see are 5 decades. The last 5 decades have been marked by this tendency to migrate not only internally but also internationally. And in the case of Guatemala, to migrate primarily towards the United States. Here we see a bit of the panorama, the regional panorama, and we see that Guatemala is not alone. Guatemala forms part of the migration corridor that we call Central America and North America. In this corridor of migration, we principally have Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras that are the original countries for the migrants. And then we have the whole Mexican territory that the migrants go through in order to reach the United States. Some of the characteristics of this migration corridor from Central America to North America are the following. First of all, a high level of irregularity. We say this because the majority of migrants migrate in an irregular manner. In other words, without documents, without visas. We know it's very difficult to obtain these documents, and that's why persons opt for migrating in an irregular manner. Another characteristic in this migration corridor is that it has reached extensive, mature social networks in the United States and has a high level of community organization in the U.S. Why? Because we have seen that there have been 5 decades in which people have been migrating, and they have strong networks of people that are settled in the United States. They're organized and they help new migrants. A third characteristic is a migration that's primarily male. We see that those who migrated originally were primarily men, but little by little we've seen how migration has been converting into more of a family migration. And the next characteristic is that it's primarily a migration with a labor characteristic and low qualified labor. These are persons who go to the United States to seek work opportunities. And what are those work opportunities? Well, maybe gardening, restaurants, working in hotels. They're jobs that don't require studies or high levels of qualifications. And now this question. Why do Guatemalans migrate? Here we know that in Guatemala, the main reasons are economic, primarily the seeking of employment and improving one's income. And that's why we have this as the biggest reason, the main reason for migration. Nevertheless, recently we've seen that are new reasons, new causes that are provoking migration of Guatemalans towards the United States. For example, the high levels of violence and the presence of gangs in Guatemalan territory, in Central American territory. Also, high levels of corruption that have caused people to be unable to access basic services like health and education, and that is causing people to want to leave their countries, their territories. We also see exclusion and racism. In the Guatemalan case, the majority of the people who migrate are indigenous of Mayan origin, and we know that historically they have been excluded and suffer racism in Guatemala. We also see environmental causes like droughts and flooding, and the effects of climate change are causing people to lose their crops and their means of a living, and they opt to migrate. Family reunification, as we spoke a few moments ago, is in an advanced stage. Many of those who migrate are children or spouses who are seeking to reunite with a family member in the United States. And finally, a cause that's more subjective, but it's the idea of the American dream. This idea of the American dream is thinking that by migrating, one will be able to offer my family better living conditions than what I have right now, but it will also make it possible to get to know another country, to travel. So this whole ideal of living the American dream is an idea that it's been put into the minds and the imagination of many Guatemalans. And now, who are the people who migrate? In Guatemala, we don't have exact data about how many people leave and where they leave from, but we have some approximate data. For example, in Guatemala, a survey is done about international migration with Guatemalan persons and remittances. This survey is done by the International Organization for Migration. In 2016, this survey allowed us to see in what places the people live who are receiving remittances from their family members in the United States. So here we have a map of Guatemala, and the departments that appear as the darkest color are the ones that receive the most remittances in Guatemala. Remittances is the money that migrants in the United States send to their family members in Guatemala. And so this data tell us that in the departments of Guatemala, San Marcos, Huehuetenango, and Quetzaltenango, those are the departments that receive the most remittances. This means that probably those are the departments where the most migrants leave from. In these departments, we see, for example, San Marcos, Huehuetenango, and Quetzaltenango. They are 3 departments primarily with population that of Mayan origin, indigenous population of Maya origin. So we see that we don't know exactly who is migrating, but if we look at the data of the remittances, we can see that primarily it's the population from this indigenous region of the country. How do people migrate? Many people ask, above all, people from the United States say, but why do people risk their lives to go to the United States? Why do people make this difficult journey? And the truth is they do it in this way because there's not a way to migrate in a regular way. As we said, it's very difficult for a person to obtain a work visa or even a tourist visa. So Guatemalan people opt to migrate in an irregular manner. The most common way to do it is to use a guide or a coyote. A coyote is the word that is known in Guatemala, the name of the guide who accompanies the migrant during the journey to the United States. To pay the coyote, generally the family has to acquire a debt. Why? Because people don't have this kind of money, so they have to take out a loan, take on debt, generally with somebody that they know who can help them pay the coyote. We know through studies that we have done that the debt can be approximately $12,000 to $13,000. It's a huge amount of money that the person has to obtain to be able to pay the coyote and be able to arrive in the United States. Upon arrival in the United States, the first thing that the migrant person does is obtain a job to be able to pay off the loan. Once the loan is paid off, the migrant begins to send family remittances to be able to support the family members in Guatemala. How do they manage to pull that money together? With the work that they do in the United States. The main jobs that Guatemalans obtain, as we said, are low qualified labor. For example, construction and painting jobs, work in restaurants, gardening, agriculture, in the meat and poultry industries, and in home deliveries. These are the jobs in which Guatemalans are employed. And what is the impact that this migration has on Guatemalan families? We see that the main impact are the family remittances that are the primary link between the migrant population and their families in their places of origin. This money arrives every 2 weeks or every month and is sent by the family member in the United States to their family in Guatemala. We know that approximately 6 million Guatemalans receive remittances. Approximately the quantity that each receives every month is $379. And what do they use this money for? Primarily for consumption and for investment. Many people use it to invest in housing or in education or in the health of their children. And one piece of data that's very relevant is that we know that many of these families, if they didn't receive this money, there would be even higher levels of poverty in Guatemala. Why? Because we know that this income that is received from the migrants is what allows the families to feed provide education and health care to the family members who are poor and primarily indigenous in the Western Highlands of Guatemala. Here in this presentation, you can see 3 images. There are 3 images of different homes of Guatemalan migrant persons. For example, in the first image, we see a 2-story house, American style, which was built or obtained by a person after having had their migration experience in the United States. While right next to it, we see what the former traditional adobe and tile home looked like, in which Guatemalan families previously lived. In the next image, we see the same thing, traditional Western Highland housing right next to a house, an American style house that of the style that are now being built by Guatemalan migrants. And in the third image, we see a house also been built by remittances that has both flags. On the left, the flag of the United States with the American eagle, and on the right, the flag of Guatemala with our national bird, the quetzal. So you see how migration has impacted in positive ways of improving housing and living conditions for Guatemalans. And where are Guatemalan migrants in the United States? Well, according to estimated data by the Foreign Relations Department of Guatemala, Guatemalan migrants are spread throughout the whole territory of the United States. However, there are 4 locations where the largest groupings of Guatemalans are. These are California, where the largest number of Guatemalans are, and then Florida, Texas, and New York. Now we're going to talk about voluntary returns and deportations. First, voluntary returns. It's important to say that the majority of Guatemalans who migrate to the United States don't do it in order to stay their whole life in the United States. They do it for a certain amount of time, to be a season there, to obtain some income, and then be able to return to their original country. So generally, the Guatemalan dream is to be able to go for a certain period of time and then return voluntarily to their country. So voluntary returns are when the person decides to return because they've reached their goal. What is the goal of Guatemalan migrant? Generally, to build a house, buy a piece of land, to have some savings for a business, and then when they are able to obtain that goal, which they can achieve in 5 or 10 years, then that person opts to return voluntarily to their original country. However, we know that many times this dream is not achieved. Why? Because people are deported before their dream is accomplished. Deportations are the returns in a forced manner in which people are obligated to return to their countries of origin. There are 2 main kinds of deportation. The first is from the interior of the United States. For example, persons who have already been living for a period of time in the United States and are detained, either through a raid or through committing some offense, and they are deported from inside the United States. However, increasingly, there are Guatemalans who are deported from the border. In other words, there are people who have not even entered the United States, and they're detained by the Border Patrol or by the Mexican authorities, and they're returned to their original country. In the photograph, we see a plane that is one of these charter flights in which they daily return migrant persons from the United States. The people who are deported from the United States come by air, while the persons who are deported from Mexican territory are sent back by land. Here we have in this graphic data from 2019, last year. And we see that a total of 105,277 Guatemalan persons were deported throughout 2019. And we see that half of them were deported from Mexican territory and half from the territory of the United States. Both Mexico as well as the United States have been deporting a huge number of Guatemalans in recent years. We also see in the map with the darkest blue are the places where the largest number of deportation events are registered, and we see that those are people who are originally from this indigenous region of the country, from Huehuetenango, San Marcos, Quiché, and Quetzaltenango, which are departments with the largest indigenous Guatemalan population. And we see how increasingly it's more difficult for Guatemalans to reach the United States, and how also in the territory of Mexico, that is being used as a filter to return people before they arrive in the United States. And that was the statistic that we had from last year, which reached a peak of deportations. It's the highest number registered in the last decade, and it was a very high peak of deportations. And for this year, something similar was expected, but nevertheless, as we're going to see, the pandemic has changed that situation a bit. So we see that there's a vicious cycle. Why do we say that there's a vicious cycle? Because, for example, the person leaves their place of origin because of this situation of poverty and violence that forces them to leave. Nevertheless, during the whole transit through Mexican territory, generally migrant persons suffer many abuses in this migration route. Then we see that they arrive at their destination, but many times they're detained when trying to enter the country. And we have seen in recent years how in these detention processes, many processes of family separation happen. And then comes the return through this process of deportation. Nevertheless, the cycle doesn't end there, because we see how it becomes a vicious cycle. This person who was deported has a debt. Why? Because in order to try to migrate, they had to take on a debt to be able to pay the coyote. So then this debt many times forces them to have to re-migrate, to try again to migrate. And we see how these people are falling into this vicious cycle. Recently in Guatemala, we have seen how people have gone through 5 or 6 processes of deportation. Why? Because they've fallen into this vicious cycle in which the only way to get out of that debt is to try again in a new migration process. And many people try despite all of the abuses and the violence that they suffer during this cycle. Now we're going to speak a bit about the impact of this coronavirus pandemic on Guatemalan migrants. And this pandemic has impacted Guatemalan migration in many ways. First of all, due to border closures. As we've seen, the majority of countries in the world took the option of closing their borders as a measure to prevent additional contagion from coronavirus. So we see many migrants in transit who have been stuck at the borders, asylum applicants and thousands of migrants in detention centers at risk of getting infected by the virus. Up until the 8th of June of this year, the Ministry of Foreign Relations in Guatemala reported that there were 5,457 Guatemalans under ICE custody. Of these, 2,577 had a final order of deportation, and 2,880 were awaiting some pending process. And we see that on the 24th of May, a Guatemalan person died who had gotten infected awaiting deportation while still in ICE custody. So we know that one of the major impacts has been this closure of the borders. This border closures have caused Guatemalans to have to wait in ICE custody, and we see there that there are high levels of crowding with so many detained migrants, with the risk of becoming infected with coronavirus is very great. And we also see how at least one Guatemalan has died with coronavirus under ICE custody. A second impact we see in migrant persons who have become infected with coronavirus in the United States. Many of these Guatemalans live with the illness in their homes and without any professional medical attention due to their irregular status and their fear of being deported. Many Guatemalans have said that they have not asked for medical help because they're afraid that because they are irregular migrants in the United States, they can be immediately deported. We have also seen how many Guatemalans have lost their jobs due to the pandemic, and this has had an impact in the reduction of the income or the remittances that they send to their family members in Guatemala. As we've already seen, especially in the first months of the pandemic, in March and April, how there was a big drop in remittances that were received in Guatemala. As of June 26th of this year, the Ministry of Foreign Relations reported that 149 Guatemalans had died in the United States of the coronavirus, the majority of them in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. So we see that this pandemic is strongly affecting the Latina population in the United States. Why? Because it's a very vulnerable population that does not have access to health services, and also even if they do, they don't seek health services because they're afraid of being deported. Many Guatemalans have died alone, and many families in Guatemala here are suffering because they can't bring the body back of the relative who has died from coronavirus in the United States. Another of the impacts of this coronavirus pandemic have been the deportations. Despite the pandemic, we see that the deportations never stopped. They have not been stopped. Both Mexico and the United States have continued expelling, deporting Guatemalans despite the pandemic we're living through. Here we have some statistics from the 13th of March up through the 13th of July. In other words, the last 4 months. In the last 4 months, 6,554 Guatemalans have been deported. Of them, 2,891 were by air and 3,663 were by land. During the first returns, we saw that the sufficient prevention measures were not taken, and that caused contagion from the coronavirus among the deported population. Also, many of the people who were deported returned to their homes without having been placed in quarantine, which also contributed to infecting family members and neighbors here in Guatemala. So we see that there was a lot of improvisation, and the first flights of returned migrants once the pandemic had begun, were done in a very improvised manner without taking the proper and necessary prevention measures. Here we have some truly alarming statistics about these deportations during a time of coronavirus. Between the 13th of March and the 13th of May, 2,122 deported people entered the country, but only 593 were tested for the coronavirus. In other words, many of these deported people were not tested, and we don't know if they already were infected or not. We also don't know if they infected family members in their homes. Of the 593 who were tested, 157 tested positive. In other words, 26% of those who were tested for COVID-19 had a positive result. We also see that during this period of time, 26 flights arrived, and of these 26 flights, 15 flights entered without the crew members being evaluated for coronavirus. In other words, of the 26 flights, 15 flights had no crew members tested, and so we don't know if the crew members had or did not have coronavirus. The 26th of March, the first 3 cases of coronavirus on a deportation flight were registered. But then an alarming statistic is that in a flight on the 13th of April, out of 76 passengers, the flight had 76 passengers total. 70 of them tested positive for coronavirus. In other words, the United States sent this flight with almost all the deported people on the plane infected with the virus. So then what happened? Well, we see that effectively after these alarming statistics in April, the government of Guatemala decided to temporarily suspend deportation flights and to demand that the United States government review its protocols. So Beginning in mid-April, the deportation processes were suspended in the latter part of April, May, and June. And the Guatemalan government demanded that the U.S. government review the conditions that Guatemalans were living in detention, as well as what the situation was in these detention centers, because they were coming back here already infected. Obviously, they had been infected in the detention centers in the United States. Beginning on the 16th of June, or about a month ago, the deportation flights were reinitiated, but now with new conditions. Now there are fewer people on each flight, and each person comes with a negative coronavirus test, and they go to a quarantine center where, after they've been there for a number of days and they don't show any symptoms, then they're able to return to their homes. And here we have some declarations from Alejandro Giammattei, the president of Guatemala, in the face of this crisis. We can see that this situation of the deportations became a diplomatic crisis between Guatemala and the United States. Here are some declarations from Alejandro Giammattei, the president of Guatemala. As a result of the flight on March 26th from Arizona, the one that we call the cursed flight, we suspended deportation by means of a letter, and we established the protocol that the United States didn't follow. Another of the declarations says, the concept of being allies with the United States is not true. Guatemala is an ally of the United States, but the United States is not an ally of Guatemala. We also see that this didn't just have an impact on a diplomatic level, but also these deportations are having a strong impact on a community level. First of all, we see that there's an increase in stigma and discrimination towards deported persons. They're rejected in their communities of origin and in their families because of fear of the coronavirus. Many people believe that because they've been deported, they already come infected with the virus, and then they're rejected in their own communities. Many communities have closed off and blocked people from the outside from returning, but we have seen a real risk, a high risk of infection. There are also family members who have returned from Mexico in blind points on the border without being tested for the virus, and in that way they've exposed their families. Something else that causes great concern on a local level are the high levels of poverty and malnutrition, and living conditions of maybe just one room for a whole family, where it's not possible to implement preventive measures to prevent cases of infection by coronavirus. And finally, we see that unemployment has increased and also poverty is increasing. Ideally, we ask ourselves, what is the alternative? Go back to migrating, trying to migrate? And that is the big question. What are Guatemalans going to do now in this situation of so much unemployment and increase in poverty? The natural response would be to try to migrate again, but what to do now in this period of a pandemic in which we know that the restrictions at the border are even greater than before? So it remains to be seen what the survival strategy will be for these Guatemalans. And finally, to wrap things up, we want to show a few signs of hope in midst of this pandemic. We know that just as many have been rejected in their communities, in other communities, people have reached out their hand. For example, here we have a sign in an indigenous community where it says, "Welcome, sister and brother migrant, back to your home. The people of Uspantan receive you with open arms." And at the bottom, they have some phone numbers where people can communicate. This is what the idea that rather than rejecting people, offering them support and also working with them on the whole issue of prevention on a community level. We also see here another sign of hope. This campaign of the International Organization for Migration, and in general from the United Nations, says if the coronavirus doesn't discriminate, because we have seen that a rich person, a poor person, a person from the United States, a person from Guatemala, all of those people can become infected. So if the coronavirus doesn't discriminate, then we also shouldn't discriminate. So this campaign also seeks to raise awareness that it's truly a virus that doesn't discriminate between people, and therefore that should also be our reaction. And also, here is a campaign that was created by the Jesuit Migrant Network, and which belongs to the university where I work because it's a Jesuit university. And the idea of this campaign is also to try to raise awareness about this subject. For example, one phrase, "They rejected me in the country to the north. Receive me in my own country. I only want to live in peace with my family." Or the impact of blaming the migrants for infecting people has been very complicated for our mission. So we see that really due to this issue, how people are rejected, but at the same time, it's not just rejection in the destination country of the United States, but also in people's own original country. At the same time, there are signs of hope in all of these campaigns that seek to raise awareness about this issue. Finally, I leave you my contact information, my email address at the university where I work. But additionally, there will be some space right now following this presentation for live questions and answers. Many thanks.
Wow. Thank you so much to Lisbeth for that amazing presentation of extremely up-to-date information and your extreme thoroughness in providing us so much information that has been very difficult actually for us in the US to receive. So thank you so much. And many thanks also to Leslie Vogel for her expertise in translation and interpretation. We really appreciate that. We only have, oh yes, absolutely. Applause, applause. Muchas gracias, Lisbeth. Wonderful information. And I think Sandra has submitted a question which I think is a good way for us to end and transition in view of the time, which is what can we do to help? Leslie.
Well, I think the question should be for Lisbeth, and I'll interpret what she says.
I would, if you would interpret, please. Thank you.
Pues yo diría que un primer aspecto en el que se puede ayudar es el trabajo desde Estados Unidos.
So I would say that a first aspect in which you can help would be work from the United States.
Por ejemplo, todo el trabajo de divulgar esta información y hacer incidencia en las iglesias, con los vecinos, con las personas cercanas.
So especially to do advocacy work. So I'm sorry, I made notes and then I can't read them. Share this information and to do advocacy work from your churches, from your neighborhoods, with your neighbors and friends.
Primero con las personas cercanas, pero luego poder hacerlo a nivel nacional. Cómo hacer incidencia en Estados Unidos sobre la forma como están siendo tratados las personas migrantes.
So begin around you, but then work on a national level as well to do advocacy work about the way in which migrant persons are being treated and dealt with.
Esa es una forma de apoyar estando en Estados Unidos.
So that's a way to help when you are in the United States.
Luego, aquí en Guatemala, pues se necesita hacer mucho trabajo. Y una de las limitantes son los recursos.
A lot of work needs to be done here in Guatemala as well, but one of the limitations are resources.
Entonces también otra forma de apoyar muchas veces son en estas campañas también económicas que pueden apoyar organizaciones que trabajan aquí en Guatemala atendiendo de forma directa en comunidades donde la migración es un tema.
So in other words, economic campaigns also with organizations that are working directly in communities where migration is a big issue. ¿Dejé algo fuera, Lisbeth?
No,
No.
también tal vez otro tema importante ahora con la pandemia podría ser cómo ayudar en tiempos de pandemia a los migrantes en Estados Unidos.
And probably another thing during this time of pandemic would be to think about how can we help migrant people who are in the United States during this pandemic.
Sabemos que muchos migrantes guatemaltecos están pasando la enfermedad en soledad, en sus casas.
We know that many Guatemalan migrants are spending their time dealing with the illness in their own homes, isolated.
Esto debido al miedo que pueden tener a ser deportados. Entonces, una forma de colaborar es también teniendo conocimiento de cómo ayudar con medicamentos, con apoyo médico, con llamadas telefónicas, con insumos, a las personas que están sufriendo la enfermedad, sobre todo a estos migrantes en sus casas.
So one way to help would be to have, well, they're staying in their homes because they're afraid of being deported, so they're not reaching out for medical help. So one way to help would be first to have knowledge of who these people are and knowledge of ways to help with medications, with medical help itself, with making phone calls to connect, and also to provide supplies. Cuando dices insumos, quieres decir como comida, cosas así.
Sí, por ejemplo, hemos oído casos incluso que, por ejemplo, no pueden ir al supermercado, ¿verdad?
So yeah,
Tal
so
vez,
in terms of supplies, like there are people that are not even able to go to the grocery store. They're ill, they can't get out, and they need food. And so even providing that kind of support. Okay.
Thank you to Leslie and to Lisbeth. And this has been incredible. Thank you so much for your expertise.
Yeah, thank you.
We are now going to take a quick flight to Oakland, California to meet Oswaldo Vidal Martin, a Guatemalan man whom I first read about in the New Yorker earlier this year. If you have not read the article, I encourage you to do so. It was eye-opening and excellent. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy our flight to Oakland. Thank you for flying CEDEPCA Air. Our flight time today will be 1 minute, 14 seconds. While you gaze out the airplane window at the landscape of Guatemala City and the outlying ravines, I will tell you a bit about the person you are about to meet. Oswaldo Martin lives in Oakland, where he migrated from Guatemala with his family when he was 4 years old. There is a sizable Hmong population there in Oakland, and Oswaldo, who is fluent in both English and Hmong, works with a local Hmong community as an interpreter in Superior Court. When Oswaldo is not doing that, he works for his father's construction company. We are so glad to have Oswaldo with us today to share his perspective. Now, gather your personal belongings and make sure your seats and tray tables are in their upright and locked position. Hello, Oswaldo. Thank you. Thank you for being here with us. We are so glad to have your voice as one of the voices that we hear today. Would you tell us a bit about your personal story of coming to the United States and then growing up here? Oswaldo is of indigenous origin from Guatemala and has spent most of his life here in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Hi, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to meet everyone. I'm glad it's very informational presentation. That last presentation was very important to me, and I think it reinforced some of the things that I've experienced or seen through people's accounts during work. What I can say about myself, my own personal story coming here to the U.S. is as far as I know, my personal lineage or migration story of my family traces back to 1982 during the genocide in Guatemala. At that time, there was a long-going civil war, as some of you might know. And in that time, I think it was in 1982, was when the soldiers in the country came to our community of Todos Santos Cuchumatan, which is located in Huehuetenango. And I came to learn about some of the details that occurred in that time just from having worked with people seeking asylum, older generations and younger generations, old, in between, and young. Everyone has in some way been impacted from the legacy of that war. But in my personal story, my grandfather wasn't there at the time, but he had heard of the news that the soldiers had arrived to the country. And so he quickly decided to flee the country. And he was among the very few, I think from what my mother has told me, in Oakland, at least there are 8, I would say, like legacy families that first set up here in Oakland, California. And he was among the very first to come here in 1982. And I would hear stories from him or from my family members about how he survived. And at that time, he was pretty much on his own, and at times would scavenge the restaurant garbage bins to find any food that he could to survive. Um, and like many of the other men, he started working in construction, and soon enough, after some time, during the Reagan administration, I think the amnesty policy at that time, he was able to get his residency status and was able to petition for my father and my aunts and uncles. But I wouldn't arrive until 1999. I was born in 1995, and I came with my mother the um, through the desert, on land by a coyote with a caravan. At that time, my mother hadn't told my father that she planned on coming to the U.S. Um, and I haven't asked them exactly why. That's a conversation that I wanted to save in a later time once I start my own family. So for personal reasons, I don't know too much about it, but I only know a few details. Um, and I remember my experience. I still have memories of when I was traveling through the desert. I remember that we would walk at night, to hide from the sun. And I still have memories of being carried by my mother, carried by other people in that caravan. Um, and I would hear more stories from my mother as I've gotten older. And so once I arrived here, because I had grown up speaking Mom, but my aunts and uncles were here, my grandparents, we all lived in I think about a 2-bedroom apartment at the time. I didn't speak any Spanish. I didn't speak any English. And I always felt safe speaking Mom at home. Um, and my world of what the Mom community was at the time was pretty much just them, just my immediate family. And it wouldn't be until later on, once I just started to see the Mom community grow before my eyes.
Could you tell us a little more about the Mom community? You're an interpreter in the Superior Courts, where there is a sizable Mom population in Oakland, and they need someone like you who has that fluency in Mom, fluency in English, and even fluency in Spanish to interpret some of the forms that they're coming across. What do you know about, what have you learned about the Mom community in Oakland, how they function, what life is like for them?
I think from the presentation, I think it outlined it very well. one of the main motivators for people to come here, and a lot of the same sentiments about wanting to be here only for a temporary moment of time. But I think the impact is most difficult when it comes to women. There's usually the pay is not as well for women, and usually the endeavor of saving up for a home to go back to retire, to own a business, it's usually something that is more along the lines of what men are capable of doing. Whereas women, it's not so much. There's not much of a support for them in that way. Sometimes that's not something that they're thinking about, and it's usually because there's just not as much opportunity, I believe. But in that same merit, I would say that women have a not easier time, and it's certainly not a great thing, but women who tend to go through a lot more discrimination and injustice in our home country. So they tend to have stronger asylum cases than most men. Most men, I believe, come here for primarily economic reasons, and I find the women who do make the journey out here, many of them do it out of necessity to survive, out of being accosted, out of being discriminated, tortured in their own country. The Mom community here in Oakland, as I saw in the presentation, hadn't grown to such a huge size until the 2010s. During my time there, I went to school and there wasn't any other mom students except maybe for one or two, or maybe younger students who weren't in my class. But I rarely ever seen mom students. And as I got older and I started to work at some of these places, it's even the same places that I had attended school. That's when I started to realize that there was a lot of mom students, mom kids, families, once they had started here, had their kids. And I've had the opportunity to be in a couple of classrooms giving presentations and talking to these students. And I would say that here in Oakland, I am very grateful that there's a lot of more opportunity to engage in this type of work and to connect with the community, that the efforts are starting to be made to understand the mom community and be there for the mom community, because I know in other places where they're not as progressive, it's there isn't that sort of level of support. It's at an institutional level. And I think that's what's great about Oakland here, and I like to keep to support it. We have mom people, young folks like myself growing up, and who are now working in these schools, being supporting administration, and I hope to have to find a mom teacher at some point. But we are steadily growing, and one of my main motivators is to see young adults or people who are going off into college to be able to connect back to the community and find that they have opportunities to work not just with the community but for the community, even in a setting such as medical or education. I personally I'm in school studying engineering, civil engineering. But I've seen the value of vocational work. A lot of people I know have gone through to be dental assistants or medical assistants, and even people who've gone to have licenses in specialties or trades of construction. And that's something that I personally support and encourage in my community here in Oakland. I worked with a small team in the census efforts. We didn't get too much support directly from the Alameda County that I live in, but we were able to do with what we had and received a grant, and we're able to estimate that there's maybe about 15,000 Hmong community members here in Oakland in our area, and from what we counted, we're about 8,000 in our own personal count during our census work a few months ago.
Oswaldo, we're going to have a time of questions for both you and Esvin, and we've already got a couple questions that came in. So first, how have you seen the asylum process change during this particular administration, the Trump administration? Have you seen, I mean, do you have any experience in your own observations of this asylum process? I know that you don't work in immigration court, but you have traveled to the border a couple of years ago to do interpretation work.
Yeah, I started working as an intern at an immigration office. That was my first experience as an interpreter. Now I do it as a sort of a freelance, but I did learn a lot of what I know about immigration processes, the asylum process, and during my stay there. And it was around the time that the new administration was coming in, as I was, you know, working on my own. But I do remember that there was the people who had been waiting to receive interviews and to for affirmative asylum applicants. A lot of them were pushed back, and a lot of people were kept waiting in limbo as to their asylum processes. And a lot of people, when the administration first came in, people who had just arrived were receiving interviews within 2-3 months of them sending out their application, which was a sort of disruptive in the way that the lawyers were handling asylum cases, because back then you had about a year or two to figure out people's cases, to work on them, to prepare their testimony, to have them ready to testify before either an immigration judge or an immigration officer or an asylum officer. But now it was completely different. Now it's less time to work, less time to gather evidence, and that 1 year bar that asylum seekers have was made even more made it even more hasty, like, environment to quickly gather all the evidence or all the testimonies that you needed and to have the person ready.
Mm-hmm. Then we have questions about the DACA program. Are you under that? Do you fall under the DACA program?
I do not. My grandfather and my father. My grandfather is a resident. Both my parents are citizens. After passing their naturalization, and so that hasn't been, an issue for me. But I've worked with a lot of others who weren't as fortunate.
Mm-hmm. Esvin, could you kind of pipe in here and tell us your relation to the DACA program and the timing of your deportation? How did that work?
Well, actually, I don't quite know if DACA and Dreamers Act, it's kind of the same,
Mm-hmm.
but I was applying for the Dreamers, program. When I arrived in 2002, I tried applying like 2 years later, but then I think this program for the Dreamers, it was passed in 2010, if I'm not mistaken, but that was a year later that I was deported. So I was in the process of it, but I didn't have the chance.
Mm-hmm. We are at the end of our time, and we're going to have a little bit of fellowship time afterwards if you can stay, but we really want to honor everyone's time. We said 90 minutes, so we're going to try to keep with that. But let's give a round of applause for Oswaldo for sharing his story, and for Esvin. Thank you, for both of you, for being vulnerable. I do want to thank all of our presenters today, especially our behind the scenes support of Cheryl Esperanza Rowan and Eric Moe. We hope that all of the stories that all of us have heard today have increased our understanding and inspired us to act. Here are some follow-up actions that you might think about taking, but we trust that the Spirit works beyond even these. Vote and encourage others to do so. Call your representative to advocate for allowing more open access to tourist and student visas. Take part in ESL classes in your community as a tutor or a mentor. Learn more about refugee resettlement programs in your community and engage in their ministry. Invite others to CEDEPCA's virtual journeys. Education opens minds and hearts. And when airports open and it is safe to travel, we hope that you will come see, smell, hear, taste, and feel the realities of life in Guatemala, because that kind of experience is so powerful in moving us to act. And finally, we are going to join in a closing prayer that is a prayer written in the Ionic community in Scotland. I will be reading most of the prayer, but there is a part in bold at the end that I invite you to say with me. Let us pray together. God, our God, you have called us to be a people on the move, traveling light, dying to live, ready to lose ourselves for the sake of the world. You have called us to be a people with a purpose, traveling without a map, traveling to where we are led, sustained by your Spirit, committed to the gospel for the hope of the world. You have called us, your people, to be the church, but we are a church with problems, too strong for the weak, too staid for the young, too respectable for the poor, too divided for mission, too obsessed with our own lives to think of the lives of others, too unsure of our message to speak to the world. Move us on our journey from where we are to where you want us to go. Open our eyes on the way to people of different cultures, continents, and countries whose stories are unfolding and intersecting with our own. Take us on our journey from where we are to where you want us to be, so that we become a community where all are welcomed and no one is excluded. All are valued and no one is made to feel inadequate. All are forgiven and no one is ashamed to belong. All are encouraged and no one is too hurt to come among us. And let us all say, lead us on our journey from who we are to who you want us to be, so that patience is built into us, kindness is assumed in us, gentleness is part of us, compassion flows from us, truth is second nature to us, and the commitment of love is part of us. Let us journey on in the peace and the power of the Spirit. Thank you so much for coming. We would love to hear your feedback, and we have shared a link to a short Google form that you can fill out right now if you have time, that will give us an idea of what we could do better next time. And there will be a next time, and that date, I believe, is August 26th. So we look forward to having you all join us again on the 26th of August. And now we wish you a safe journey home. If you would like to stay on this Zoom call to say hello to our staff, to each other, maybe you have another question you want to put in the chat box to one of our speakers, the room will be open for another 15 minutes. Que Dios les bendiga. Adiós.
Bye-bye.
Gracias, gracias.
Gracias.
Gracias, Osvaldo.
Sí. Thank you, Osvaldo. That was great. Yeah.
Thank you for
Oh, there's
having me.
Ana Pastor's baby with her. Hola,
Thank
Ana.
you. Good to see you all. Thank you, Esvin.
It was a
Osvaldo.
great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Joy.
Thanks, Joy.
Gracias.
Enjoyed it very much.
I'm not getting the link for the evaluation, but everything is wonderful, and I'm so thankful for everybody's presentations and also for the small group. That was really great, and I love videos too. God
Good.
bless.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Obviously, a lot of work went into this, and I appreciate everyone's input and all the work that was behind the scenes. That this is an incredible program to do on Zoom.
Thanks,
Thank
Jan.
Thank you.
This was so well done, and thank you, Leslie, for your interpretation, and also for letting those of us from Palo Christi know that this was happening. I wish there were a way that we could advertise it better so that more people could be aware of it, because it's definitely very much worth the 90 minutes that it takes to watch it. It's very eye-opening, and I think people, once you learn about this and become more aware, it certainly does open your heart to want to help more.
Thanks, Linda. I see in the chat that they're going to send. Oh no, that's the link to the survey. But there is going to be a recording of this too made available. Probably
Yeah.
that will be sent in an email as well. Nancy's nodding her head.
Yes.
Would we be allowed to share this with our congregations?
Yes.
Absolutely.
And I think Baldir wanted to share with us something. Baldir, you
Well, thank you from all of us in Baltimore. This has been a wonderful second experience on your virtual tour, and